Okay. But it's really possible. I mean, about it, yeah. I don't do today. Pardon?
Yeah, what's up?
I forget. Do we have work in to do? No.
No, not today.
Not yet?
And there's a good Jesse. It's like 600. It's like,
You're important.
so I got really good. It's extremely crazy. Then like it works. It stops. Like that was great. No. That's what I was going to yeah. It's like water, like from. Okay.
Like you're the stuff like.
And watch that video. I mean, it was fun. Okay, so the documentary. After for the. So I saw. Yeah, I think they're all fun. So what were your plans? Like you said, your plans, they got.
But over the things that I'm already. I would have to drive to the stuff. So then for what? I don't have a percent. So
Yeah.
I don't stay.
All right, good morning. Everyone survived our wild weekend. But I've heard two different phrases that we had a hurricane and an earthquake. I'm not sure which one I like better. What was that?
I've heard.
Hurricane, like it sounds like a movie, right? That will be directly connected to Sharknado, right? Which we watched over the weekend. It was so bad. I've seen it before, but I forgot how bad it was. But really eventful, right? Though everybody was bracing for like this massive hurricane, tropical storm level like event, and it rained. What was that?
There were I got 3 Amber Alerts yesterday.
Oh, yeah.
That's the most I've gotten in one day.
There were so many alerts, right? There were flash flood warnings, earthquake warnings, like it was eventful. I mean, bottom line, I love the rain. So I was just grateful that it rained. And the earthquake was the weirdest part of all of it. Like we went out to Don Cuco's and we were sitting there eating. And I thought my kids were just shaking the table. Like I was this close to screaming at them, like, what are you doing? Stop. And then, then all the lights were moving and everyone's phones went off. It was very like eventful this weekend. Did anyone lose power at all? We lost the internet, which was like the end of the world. They were like, the internet's out. What are we gonna do? I don't know. Right. Nobody lost power? Nothing? That's good. Right? We were ready. We had a state of emergency. LAUSD schools are closed today. Like it was an overreaction, I think, but we all made it, so that's good, right? We're gonna enjoy the last of this beautiful weather before it warms up. Anyway, hopefully everyone's houses and everything were fine. We just have a little bit of like leak from our roof, but that's it. We will pick up where we left off. We're gonna keep going with chapter 1 today. So we spent a lot of time last time. I'm gonna back up for a second here. We spent a lot of time talking about these D's, right? The D's of abnormality. What's normal, what's abnormal. So remember we had deviance, distress, dysfunction, danger, and duration, right? 5 Ds, which are kind of that general guideline that we might use. They're not diagnostic, but it's a great guideline to have. And what we'll look at today are what are some of the ways that we viewed abnormality in the past? And what are some kind of current trends, current jobs, kind of building up to today. So we're gonna look at some ancient views first, and then kind of slowly work our way toward like a modern view. So if we go back to kind of early recorded history of viewing mental illness, and I think I mentioned this last time, but we have a really shameful history when it comes to mental illness and how we've treated it. We have done all sorts of bizarre, dangerous, cruel, odd things over the years because we didn't know any better. right? It wasn't until maybe about 100 years ago that we got things like therapy, right? And talking to people. If we go back in time, it was thought that abnormal behavior was the work of evil spirits or magical beings. So if somebody had abnormal behavior and they were seeing things or hearing things or acting strangely, it's because they were possessed by something evil, right? And so treatment focused on getting those demons and evil spirits out of the body. This was popular and common for years. If somebody was seeing things that weren't there, it was the devil, right? Or demons, right? In their body and in their mind, and we have to get them out. And there were two main ways that we did that, trepanations and exorcisms. And both of them very dangerous. People died constantly, like all the time in these procedures. They were awful, right? Trepanation is what's happening with that skull image up there, right? With a trepanation, you take like a circular, like a stone instrument, and you cut away circular sections of the skull so that the demons could escape. That's what the holes were for, to let the evil spirits out. Now, as you can imagine, people died during these procedures, right? Like they literally would take an instrument and either tap holes or cut holes in somebody's skull, causing massive brain damage or death oftentimes. But if somebody was agitated, angry, flailing, yelling, screaming, and all of a sudden they're quiet because we damaged their brain so badly, but they're quiet. Success, we've treated them. They're better, they're calmer, right? So this happened for years. And if we didn't do trepanations, we did exorcisms, where we would have an old priest and a young priest, right? Traditionally, as we have in movies. And we would try and coax the evil spirits out of the body through a ritualistic event. Yeah.
I recall reading that trepanations were also used to help, like if the brain is swollen.
Yeah.
Actually, like literally space.
Later. Yeah,
Later?
for
Okay.
sure. So in the early days, it was for evil spirits, to let those evil like demons and demonic spirits out. But later, when we got to things like lobotomies, where we were actually drilling holes in the skull and into the brain, some of that was related to pressure as well, right? And it had a different purpose. It was to damage parts of the brain to relieve the suffering or cause like changes to occur in the brain.
Yeah.
So yeah, we did, but that was a little bit later. This was more spirit related, then that was more biological in like the 1900s. Yeah.
So same case, just different things.
Yep. Yeah, like if you ever watched the Nurse Ratched like show on like Netflix, I think it was on, they did a lot of lobotomies to relieve pressure and damage parts of the brain in like the 1900s. Mhm. Other thoughts or comments, questions, anything for now? Yeah. So this is way back, or like medieval times, like BC, like and all the way up, honestly, into like the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, we were doing a lot of this stuff. So it was a very long period of time that we believed this, because religion played a huge role in some of these belief systems, right? And it's something that's still practiced today. Not trepanations, but exorcisms are still practiced today. And they're featured in a ton of movies, right? Like I think I told you before, I'm a huge horror movie fan. There are so many more like I can add onto here, right? But here's some of them. Like it's a constant theme that comes up in these horror movies. Is somebody possessed by the devil, or is it mental illness, right? And sometimes we don't know. Sometimes it's a matter of your faith and what lens you look at it through. If you look at it through a religious lens, you might believe that somebody's possessed, in which case an exorcism could cure them, right? Like a placebo effect kind of situation. If you believe you're possessed and somebody performs an exorcism, you might get better, right? Versus if we believe that it's mental illness, rather than a religious lens, we're going to go through a scientific lens and give you medication or psychological treatment. And that's something that, again, you see in a lot of these, like the exorcism of Emily Rose. The whole thing is like a trial. Did we treat this young woman for having schizophrenia or demonic possession? Right? The Rite, which I'm going to show you a clip from in a moment, again, the same thread, right? Of is it one or the other? And so a lot of that comes down to how you view a phenomenon. And for us, we're looking at it from a scientific, psychological standpoint. But if you're religious, again, in theory, an exorcism could be quite helpful. So let me play, I have a little clip from this movie. There's nothing like overly scary in it, which may make you happy or sad, depending. But just a little clip from that where they're talking, it comes up quite a bit in all these movies and others And we still, as I mentioned, do practice this today. There are still exorcisms practiced. They're just a lot less common than they used to be. But for years and years, that was the main way, right, to rid somebody of mental illness. We viewed it as possession. And so we have to get that spirit out of the body in order to make you better. Any comments or thoughts or questions? I'm ready for more scary movies to come. Like I've got the Nun 2 on my calendar. I'm ready to go, ready to be scared by Valak. Okay. As we move forward, we get a different perspective. And you see this all the time in psychology, right? Like paradigm shifts, different perspectives on what causes things, what are the main contributors. So for a lot of years, we had possession, right? Then we moved to a different idea, like in the Greek and Roman times, we got a lot of philosophers and physicians, right? And so with philosophy and physicians, we get a different standpoint, a different view on mental illness. Hippocrates, who's sometimes called the father of modern medicine, he believed that mental illnesses had physical or natural or medical causes to them. And so what he proposed is that we all possess what he called humors. According to Greek and Roman physicians, humors were these like bodily chemicals that we all possess. They run through the body. They're fluids within our body. And if these fluids are out of proportion, they could cause problems. There was also interesting correlations to personality. Sometimes we talked about people who had too much of one of these having a personality type. But more here, we're looking at mental illness. And where this, how we got this idea of these different biles and phlegm and blood and so on, if you were to take blood out of somebody's body and let it sit and let it settle, it settles into like 3 layers. Now he added a 4th layer, but let's see if I try and draw like a little beaker of sorts. I'm a horrible artist, but yeah, that could be worse, right? 4 layers. So if you were to let blood sit for a period of time, it would separate out, right? And so the top layer is what he would call like the yellow bile. And the yellow bile, like the equivalent of that would be like the yellow serum or plasma in blood. So yellow bile is a fluid produced by the liver, right? If someone had too much yellow bile, we would say they were frenzied, like they had too much activity, maybe something we would equate to like ADHD, or maybe even mania. As part of like a bipolar diagnosis. So too much yellow bile would have correlations to different mental illnesses. Underneath that, we had the white blood cells. And the white blood cell layer equates to phlegm. Isn't that a lovely thought, that you could have too much phlegm in your system? So if people had too much phlegm, right, or like snot, we could think of it as, if you're like, what's phlegm? Phlegm was thought to make you lazy, right? So if you had too much phlegm, you were slow and lazy, like apathetic. And for each one of these, depending on what you had too much of, there were treatments for it, right? So if you had too much phlegm, therapeutic vomiting was the treatment, right? We give you herbs and make you vomit to get the phlegm out of your system, and then it will go back to balance, right? If you had too much yellow bile, we had treatments for that too. That one, there's like less on the yellow bile, but the phlegm, we did stuff like therapeutic vomiting and herbs. The blood is the next layer, and that's the red blood cells. Right, so this is what it is, and that's what it equates to with his humors, right? If you had too much blood, it was thought that you were overly cheerful, right? Which doesn't sound so bad, right? You're too happy, right? But we would do things like bloodletting to reduce the amount of blood in your system, and people would die during these procedures. Like we put leeches on people to suck the blood out, or just remove blood from their system, and it was thought to restore you back to balance. Yeah.
You still eat leeches, right?
I mean, in like a more like off-label use, I would say, if there's a labeled use for leeches, right? But it's not common anymore. I mean, I won't say nobody does, but it's definitely like a common medical practice. But it was at that time, right? We put leeches on somebody and remove that blood to get them to like balance. And then finally at the bottom, there would be like a dark sludge layer. This isn't an actual layer, but I'm just gonna put dark sludge, right? And this would be the black bile. And so Hippocrates and other people believed if you had too much black bile, that it was unshakable sadness or melancholy, right? And so it would cause people to have depression, right? And so with all of these, if you had too much, right, we had treatments for it. And it was thought that these different bodily fluids were equating to mental illness. Now, there's no like scientific evidence to back this at all. But it was one of the first like medical perspectives and saying that instead of supernatural causes, it's physical or natural causes. Yeah. Too much phlegm, you were lazy, right? Lazy, like apathetic, slow. Yeah. Yeah, and that's a great question. We don't have a lot of great documentation on that. So they would remove blood and then they would let it sit. And you would see what people had. And it was thought that they needed to be in balance. And so if one was bigger than the other, it was out of balance. And that would like dictate treatment. That's kind of the best idea that we have. Again, it's completely not backed by science in any way, but it was an early idea. No, they would try to bring the other ones in balance, right? So you would always have some, right? Because your blood would separate into those layers. But if you had too much, that's what they would do. More than the not enough, there was the too much that we tried to do. Was that it? Yeah.
What was the yellow bile for?
Yellow bile was the frenzied activity, right? So if you had too much, you were like frenzied or like manic. In the Middle Ages, we go back to demonology, back to spirits, back to the supernatural. The Middle Ages were all about the church, right? The clergy playing a big role. And so what we see here is that if you had any kind of dysfunction, it was the result of Satan. No longer demons or evil spirits, but the devil himself, right, was causing that dysfunction. So we went back to a lot of things like, again, the trephinations and exorcisms and so on. Those were really, really common at the time. We got an interesting shift as we got to the Renaissance. Renaissance was a period of like rebirth, artistic thought, more positivity. And so in the Renaissance period of time, this doctor named Dr. Johann Weyer came up with an idea that he called the asylum. Now, if you were to picture an asylum, like what are some of the things that you think of? Like when you think of an asylum, what do you see in your head? Like what are some of the things you see? Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. All right, white padded walls. What else? Anyone else? What do you picture in your mind?
Mental hospitals.
A mental hospital, okay. Anything else? Yeah.
Overly sterile.
Okay, like a really sterile environment, white padded walls. Yeah. Straight jackets, for sure. Oh, like I had my arms crossed. It was perfect like that, right? Straight jackets. Do you picture like a clean, healthy environment? Like I picture like American Horror Story season 2. Yeah, like asylums, like dark, dirty, gross, like awful conditions. Right. And that's what asylums were. A lot of the like straight jackets, white, like sterile, was more like the state hospital that came later. Asylums started with the best intentions. Johann Weyer, this doctor, said, what if we remove people who are struggling from their lives and we put them out in a big relaxing house out in the country where they can relax and calm down and be away from the difficulties of their life. They'll calm down, they'll be easier, they'll be healthier, and they'll be fine. That's how asylums were created. That's not what they became, right? Asylums were very popular for a time, but people were subject to like bizarre and cruel and dangerous procedures because we didn't know how to treat them. And so people died. They rotted in their own filth. They became like warehouses and jails for people who were mentally ill. So we had no idea what to do to help them. We had these bizarre things like these restraining cribs where people would be locked in a crib where you couldn't move. We'd spin people in chairs until they passed out, bleed them with leeches, right? Electroshock therapy became popular later, right? Just awful, awful conditions, but out of the best intentions, right? And these were common and popular for years before they transitioned to something else later. So the asylum was developed during this time, again, with good intentions, but that's not at all not at all what they became. The most infamous, so famous in a bad way, right, of all asylums is an asylum called Bethlehem Hospital in London. Now, this was probably the most famous of all, right, and for bad reasons. Interesting, Bethlehem was the name of the hospital, but over time, the name changed to represent and kind of symbolize like chaos or madness. Bethlehem became Bethlehem, and then eventually it became Bedlam. This became known as Bedlam Hospital. Bedlam translates to chaos or madness. And so we get the idea of the lunatic for the first time, right? Someone who was crazy or insane or mad, right? And that's kind of what this hospital became synonymous with. And I found a little excerpt from a documentary. It's only like a minute, but it shows you kind of like the scope. These were palaces in a way. These were massive, massive places. But again, not the best of conditions. So let me play this for you. It's just like a minute or so of this documentary. The intention of helping them to recover, right? And Bethlehem, or Bedlam as it became known, was the most famous of all of them. If this was in London, there were definitely some here, but it was much more common in Europe at the time than it was in the United States. Frozen here. If we move forward again, right, continuing forward, attitudes and conditions for people who had mental illness started to change drastically in the 1800s. We got a completely new idea called moral treatment. Now, before the 1800s, with asylums and trepanations and exorcisms and all these bizarre treatments, we didn't treat people very well. But in the 1800s, we got this thing called moral treatment, and it was this revolutionary, controversial idea that we could treat people who have mental illness with respect, that they were people who deserved to be treated with respect. And we still didn't know what that meant, but it was just a shift of mentality. And so out of this shift became the creation of what we called a state hospital. State hospitals were intended to fix all of the issues from asylums. They were going to have more funding, better resources, better treatments, but they ran into all the same issues that asylums did because we still didn't know how to help people. But these state hospitals were intended to be driven by moral treatment, and they were kind of thought to be better. But again, they ran into a lot of the same issues because they didn't know how to cure people. But these state hospitals, they popped up everywhere, right? And again, these massive, massive buildings, and some interesting like pieces of art came out of this time too. Here's one of them. This one talks about Philippe Pinel, I've heard it both ways. He was one of the first people to be a big proponent of moral treatment. And so this is the Paris Asylum for Insane Women. And so he was one of the first to remove the chains from the patients, to not lock them up or chain them to the wall, which was a common practice. He would talk to his clients or patients for the first time, believing that maybe that could help, that there were psychological ways we could help instead of like bleeding and starving and bloodletting and all of these different things that we did before. So we get this piece of art that came out of the time, right, showing this shift to moral treatment. My favorite one is this one though, Dance in a Madhouse, sometimes called the Lunatic Ball. One of the practices that became common was letting these patients in these state hospitals have huge parties or social like galas, like a ball, if you will. And so they would get dressed up and get to dance with each other and have these big social events as a way of providing respectful interaction with each other. And this painting comes out of that time, and you can see they're portraying them as mentally ill by kind of distorting their faces. But I always think it'd be so fun to be a fly on the wall at one of these parties. Like, can you imagine these massive, like, huge parties of like all these people with mental illness dancing with each other and being like regulated by all the people around them? And again, just another piece of art that came out of the time showing this shift to trying to give like respectful, like more humane treatment with social interactions and responsibilities and so on. Still very flawed, but a completely different approach. Any thoughts or questions, comments, anything for now before I keep going? Mm-hmm. I found an interesting, I was looking for a clip of these old state hospitals. A lot of the state hospitals that were around the country, our country and others, kind of fell out of favor after a short period of time. So as we get into like kind of more now, state hospitals aren't very popular anymore. They are featured in an absolute ton of movies, like kind of ranging from more modern to older. Shutter Island, probably one of the more popular ones up here. But One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, if you haven't seen it, old classic psych film you have to watch. And then some TV shows and movies and so on. Very, very common to feature them. And sometimes they're stereotyped or they're more creepy. They're like haunted in some way. But they have fallen out of favor, right? As of like now, we don't tend to have very many of them anymore. A lot of them were shut down or converted to other things like Cal State Channel Islands, right? Like the college. My first job that I ever had as a psychology, like anything psychology related, I was working at a psychological or a psychiatric hospital in San Diego that's now a YMCA, right? Which is so bizarre to think, right? Like they took this huge building and turned it into like a YMCA. People are working out in the group therapy rooms now, which is just funny to me. But so many of these places were converted. And I went to one more up in Santa Rosa area, a little bit north of that. It was converted to a Buddhist monastery, which was super interesting. I got to spend the night in it for one night as part of a class. It took a 1-unit class called it was related to Buddhism, just for fun. And we got to go to this monastery and stay overnight. And they told us when we got there that it was an abandoned psychiatric facility and we'd be staying in the old wards. And I was like equally terrified and fascinated by that. Like I was so scared, but so excited. And we were in this room and like everything was lime green tile, like old. You could totally feel the energy in it. I was so grateful because they separated the boys and the girls, like so bizarre that they did that. But my partner and I got to be in the same room. So that was fun. I was like, this is nice. I would be so scared if you weren't here. But really interesting. There's these places all over the country that overnight almost became abandoned as we shifted away from like this approach to different approaches. And I found a little like YouTube compilation and it just shows you like the scope and size of these. Yeah.
Back when I went to college the first time, I needed 1 unit. And so I signed up to go to a hospital. Psychology was not my major, and I just needed the units. I didn't really know what I was in for. I believe it was Sonoma State.
Okay.
And I was placed with the geriatric care part. But this one woman came in, she was a little younger, maybe in her 60s, Down syndrome, and she had been sterilized. And she lived there. She had lived there for a long time. But listening to her tell her story was so like such a great way to humanize it for us. And she definitely, was sad about that, of course. And it was harsh.
Yeah, there's so many awful treatments that we do, you're not going to be able to pass on your genetic line because you are mentally ill, or we're going to do electroshock therapy in batches because that's the way we're going to treat you. And for so many years, it took nothing to get locked up. Like a husband can have his wife locked up for any reason, right? She's not having sex with me, she's crazy, lock her up. Like, I mean, I'm not joking. That was literally the case. If you weren't unhappy, especially like if a man was unhappy with his wife, he'd have her locked up for no reason whatsoever. And so we have all these like wonderful, like ethical, moral guidelines now that we didn't have before. But there were things that we did that were just atrocious because we didn't know any better. All right. So we have to be grateful for things like therapy now because it's so much better than some of the things that we had in the past. Let me show you this little compilation. And again, it's just kind of for fun. It's set to like Radiohead, which I think is funny. But it is state hospitals ran into all the same issues that the asylums did. Right. But they did try. They were trying to approach things from a different mentality. Again, lots of like movies and shows featuring these and even more beyond what's up here. But we don't tend to do that anymore. Right. We have very few state hospitals now. Right. And the places that we do have are much smaller. They're like wings of a traditional hospital rather than these massive buildings on their own. It's not the norm anymore to lock somebody away for years or months at a time, the way that it was for so long, right? And so these are some of the current trends that we have as we kind of get into like what we're doing now as we've built up to that. Medication is a massive trend that we have, right? There is a medication for everything and a medication for every side effect that's caused by that medication, right? Like medications are so common. And we'll talk about this all semester, like for every disorder, what are the medications that might be helpful, right? And they oftentimes have side effects, right? It's very common to have side effects. It takes some time to find the right one, but there are an incredible number of medications to help with mental illnesses. We've come a long way in that over the last like 50 plus years. Deinstitutionalization is the like trend of not putting people in these hospitals anymore. Rather than institutionalizing someone and removing them from their life, we try and treat people more in like private therapy or outpatient treatment. Inpatient treatment means we put you in a facility versus outpatient treatment, you're treated out in the world, right? And you go home afterward. Locking people away in these hospitals, the second you release them, their issues come back, right? The second they go back to their lives. So we've learned that there are better ways like therapy. Right? Therapy was something that Freud, for the most part, invented about 100 and something years ago. Talking to people and using a variety of techniques. We'll talk about a lot of different types of therapy in here, different modalities, different approaches. But private therapy is very common. And over the last like 3 to 5 years, we've seen a huge increase in like cyber therapy or online therapy, especially during COVID. Almost all forms of therapy went virtual. Right. And a lot of that has actually remained. There's a lot of virtual therapy that is used. And we do a lot of efforts on prevention. Let's identify risk factors early so that we can try and turn things around before they escalate and develop. So these are things that are very common now. A lot of medications and therapies, which we'll talk about all semester, along with focusing on prevention and treating people out in the world rather than locking them away. All right. So some shifts over time, definitely shifted quite a bit as we've gone through the years. We've talked a lot about what's normal versus abnormal. We're going to talk about a lot of different types of treatment over the course of the semester. And just to put this out there, just briefly, as much as there's disagreement about what's a disorder and what's normal versus abnormal, there's disagreement about what's treatment, like what constitutes a treatment or a therapy. And so we have these kind of very vague guidelines, and they're vague for a reason. It accounts for a lot of different ideas. So Jerome Frank, a very like famous clinician who studied this concept, said that all forms of therapy have 3 essential features to them. The first is that you have someone who's suffering who seeks relief from a healer. Now, the fact that we say healer means that this is open to be a doctor, like a medical doctor. It could be a therapist, a psychiatrist, a social worker, a priest, or a shaman or a religious figure. This could be anyone, right? So we leave it broad on purpose. And that healer has training that is accepted by the person who goes to them, right? So if you're religious and you believe that your rabbi is the best source of healing for you, right, then that would be your healer, right? If you go to a medical doctor because you believe in medical like model and biology, right, that would be your healer. A therapist could be your healer. It could be anyone. And then there's a series of contacts between the healer and the sufferer where you do something, right, in order to try and get better. So there are an incredible number of types of treatment, from biological things to more therapy-driven things or talk-related things to behavioral stuff. And we'll talk about those all semester, again, as we get into the disorders in like a week or two. And there's just as much disagreement here as there is with how do we decide what's normal versus abnormal. Any thoughts or questions? Anything for now before we keep going? So before I talk about these different types of therapists and professions, out of curiosity, how many of you in here are considering a career in psychology? You might not know what, you may not be sure. Lots of you, anyone want to share? What are you thinking of? Anyone have a thought? What are you thinking of doing yet? Okay, psychiatrist, right? They make a lot of money. That's amazing, right? Anyone else? What else? Yeah.
Child psych.
I love it. Child psych, psychiatrist, anyone else? Thoughts? A lot of you raised your hand. You don't have to know yet. It's okay. I went into community college thinking it was going to be a psych major, and then I changed it to economics and then back to psychology, and I got a degree to be a therapist and then became a teacher. You can change, right? That's fine. You can evolve as you go. There are so many different professions within this realm. And before we talk about the different types of therapists, one other thing I want you to do, I want you to find a few people around you, and let's look at some stereotypes of therapists for a minute, because there are a lot of stereotypes of therapy and therapists. Probably the easiest one, the one I think of the most, is how does that make you feel? Right? It's like the statement that you have to say as a therapist. I said it once, an apologist, right? It was like, how does that make you? Oh my gosh, I really just said that, right? Like, so sorry. So therapist-y, right? But what I want you to do, find a few people around you. You might write it down just so you remember, because I'm hoping you'll share. What are some stereotypes of therapy or therapists, people who go to therapy, anything related to therapy? What might you find in the room? What might they say? What might they do? Anything related to therapy, therapists, or people who go. So I'm gonna give you just a few minutes, but in like whatever's convenient around you, 2, 3, 4 people, come up with some ideas and we'll hopefully you'll be willing to share. Find a few people, go ahead and talk about it. Write it down so you remember.
The people's mind around it. There's the highest.
That's very loud.
It's the same place.
What are these called?
Oh, yeah, hacking on.
I think, I don't know, it's not a thing that does it anything. I just like his finger.
I don't know.
I do. No, I didn't have like it.
Lock me in a room. You trust me. Yeah.
Yeah, there's one Mark, don't share.
Yeah.
It's just unreal.
Do they like lock you down?
I don't know.
Right, most of you look like you've tapped out your mental list of stereotypes and associations. What are some things that you wrote down? What's other than how does that make you feel? Which the follow-up to that, by the way, is tell me more about that. That's the follow-up statement to how does that make you feel. But what else did you write down? What are some stereotypes that you have? What comes to mind? What do you think? Yeah. Yeah, you gotta lay on a couch. There's gotta be a couch, right? I'll show you the couch that started it all when we talk about Freud. Freud invented the couch, that his couches looked awfully uncomfortable, right? But yeah, couch for sure. Yeah.
Like, you know, when you walk in, you see the couch, there's always the box of tissues right next to it. And
Yeah.
then a jar of candy on the table.
Uh-huh. My therapist doesn't have candy. I wish she had candy, right? But tissues, there's always the box of tissues, right? For sure, because you're gonna cry, right? That's what happens in therapy. Right. Yeah. The clipboard, they have a clipboard. What are they doing with that clipboard? Judging. Judging, right? Okay, so clipboard judging, I think taking notes, right? They're always taking notes, writing everything down, right? What other stuff? What else did you come up with? What else do you picture? Like anything else? There's so many more. I can think of so many more. Yeah.
Oh, that eye contact?
Okay. From you or from them?
Well, I can make eye contact. Imagine like in my mind's eye, I imagine that people will make eye contact.
Okay. Okay. I like it. I did this. Okay. Okay. I always picture a bobblehead. They're like, uh-huh, 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 uh-huh. All right. Tell me more about that. How does it make you feel? right? Like a bobblehead taking notes, all those things. Okay, lack of eye contact. What else? There's some other things. Yeah.
It's expensive.
Yeah. Okay.
At least a lot of people have it.
It's true, and I saw a bunch of you nodding right at it. It can be expensive. Insurance makes it complicated sometimes. Other stuff, yeah.
Sweaters.
They have a sweater.
Filipino sweaters.
Okay. I like that, right? A sweater, right? Do you picture degrees on the wall? I picture lots of degrees, right? Like, I promise I have the credentials to do this, right? Or, like a little like rock garden or a fountain's got to be in there somewhere, right? That's really common. I'm trying to think of other stuff. So bookcases filled with books, right? For sure. I picture someone like who's older with glasses, for sure. Like always, that's the image that comes to my mind. How about anyone have the thought that the therapist has issues themselves at all? Really common that people who go into the field of psychology have issues themselves, right? You can take that for what you will. It's therapy, right? It's common that therapists go into it because they've gone through stuff themselves as well. Hopefully not so much that they can't be objective, right? And they're like, let me tell you about my life, right? But it's really common that therapists have some baggage themselves. Yeah, do you have a
I guess this is less like a physical thing.
Sure.
But a lot of time when people bring up therapy.
Yeah.
So I hear a lot that people think therapists are like not genuine.
Okay. Right.
They don't declare.
Mhm.
I hear a lot of that stuff.
I love that you brought that up. Super common stereotype that the therapists are there for the money, they don't actually care. And of course, there are people who are going to be like that. But a lot of therapists do really genuinely care. That was my problem as a therapist. I cared too much, right? Which is why it wasn't for me. Like I had bad empathetic boundaries. I'd go home and just like be upset and like hurt for their pain, right? You have to have good boundaries. People care a lot. Yeah.
That they try to persuade you to their way of thinking.
Okay, I like that. I'm gonna tell you what to do or how to think about this or so on. I like that. And one that I have, so, and I love that you said too, there's a stigma around it. Like I just shared a second ago, my therapist, right? And I had a second of like, oh, I shouldn't have said that. But then I think it's healthy, right? Like I'm trained as a therapist. I think it's good to go to therapy. Everyone could benefit from it. But my therapist always says, don't forget to practice self-care. That's like her thing. That's my instant stereotype now of therapy is like, don't forget self-care. I'm like, what do you mean by that? She's like, well, take care of yourself. I'm like, okay. And self-care as a side note became self-cake for us. I was like, okay, I'll go home and practice self-care. I'm gonna have some cake tonight to take care of myself. So now she's like, don't forget to practice self-cake. I'm like, oh, I won't. I'm excellent at self-caking. Self-care. Anyone have anything else? Anything else? Stereotypes or yeah, sorry. Okay, I like that. A picture of the family somewhere in there. Yeah.
I really like these conversations for like an hour.
Interesting, but sorry, time's up. It's so funny. They always portray, and I'll show you a clip of therapy soon. I think it's in chapter 2. It's always like there's like this wonderful revelation and then time's over. But like it happens so neatly. That never is the case. It's like, okay, I need you to stop crying now. We're done, right? Like then have another like appointment after this. Like it very rarely is that way. It's funny though. It's a common stereotype though. Anything else that you can think of?
You're in therapy with someone else. Not that it's a bad thing, but it gets old, and that's the active listening.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, active listening is
Amazing, but like, I'm so like, you go right into it.
Sure.
But for a while,
it's a lot, but it can be a lot. Anybody else? Want to rob you of your chance? I have one more. That therapists are always analyzing people. Always, like even when they're not in therapy. Like the second that I tell somebody I teach psychology, there's a reaction every time. They'll be like, what do you do for a living? I'm like, oh, I teach at Moore Park College. They're like, oh, that's amazing. What do you teach? Psychology. And there's always a like, oh, and a step back. Like, don't look at me, right? Like I'm analyzing them. I'm like, analyzing takes a lot of effort. I'm not doing it right now. I promise you. Right. But I have friends who I went through the counseling program with who are always wearing their therapist hat. And it's so obnoxious, right? And what I mean by wearing their therapist hat is like one of my friends, Judith, I'll call her Judith, right? I was like, oh my gosh, Hazel's not sleeping. It's driving me nuts. I'm so tired. That's part of her journey. I wish her journey would happen during the day. Like, it's like that, like, she just needs to go through this, right? That's like that voice that comes with it. There's the voice, and like, you know, I'm like, just let me be upset, you know, I'm like, you need to honor Paisley's process. I'm like, yeah, I'll honor it in the morning, right? Not right now, not at 2 a.m. I'm not so great at honoring the process at 2 a.m. So that they're always analyzing, always have that like therapist hat on is another one. But there are so many stereotypes, and sometimes they're true, right? I heard Don, you were talking about that over here, right? Sometimes stereotypes are there for a reason because they're accurate, right? And other times they are just that, stereotypes. But there are tons of careers that you can pursue. They're very degree dependent. In order to be any of these things, you need at least a master's degree, which takes some time, right? Typically, 2 years to 3 years after your bachelor's degree. So let's look at some of these, and I put a little chart up here. I'll leave it up, so if you need to like take a picture of it at the end, you can. I know that we're getting whiteboards in here. I got an email over the weekend. I was so excited. They're like, we're getting whiteboards. It's like Christmas, like it's exciting. Been a chalkboard forever. But these are different. Right? So counseling psychologists, clinical psychologists, and psychiatrists are all different. Right? So let's talk about how they're different a little bit. A counseling psychologist typically has a master's degree. So they have an MA, which typically takes like 2 to 3 years after your bachelor's. That's what I have. I have a master's in counseling psychology, right? Typically people who have that are training to be an MFT, a marriage and family therapist, which is the name in California. If you are a clinical psychologist, you have a PhD. So more education, more student loans, right? But this is typically like 5 to 6 plus years after your bachelor's degree. More education, for sure. A psychiatrist actually has a medical degree. So an MD, this is like 7 plus years, depending on how many units you're taking and so on. So you can see like there's a change in like the education that you do. And this shapes the focus of what each of these people do. So someone who is a counseling psychologist or counseling therapist, they tend to focus on everyday issues. So everyday issues or problems. Stress, anxiety, maybe a little bit with depression and mood, relationships, communication, lighter stuff in theory, because they have less education. That's not always the case, right? Sometimes people who have this specialize in areas and they deal with more intense clientele, but typically people who have a clinical psychology focus, who have a PhD, they do more with like disorder. Assessment of disorders, right? Like giving people psychological batteries, dealing with people who have things like schizophrenia or bipolar, more intense disorders because they have more training. Anyone know what the psychiatrist focus is? Very different than the other two. Yeah. Yep, medication, perfect. So typically, someone who's a psychiatrist focuses on medication. If you go to see them, you might talk a little bit about how you're doing, but the focus is on medication. How are you tolerating it? What are the side effects? The appointment time for these differs too. So a psychiatrist, it's only about 20 minutes. Okay, appointments with psychiatrists are typically short after the first one. And it's checking in. It might even be virtual, right? At this point, a lot of them are virtual. But the focus is on what are you taking? How is it affecting you? Is it helping? And it's very common that someone will see a psychiatrist and also see one of these other two. These two have a 50-minute appointment, typically. The therapy hour is 50 minutes, right? 50 minutes. So typically you'd have a 50-minute appointment, and they're going to do some kind of talking or techniques or approaches to deal with whatever's going on, versus focusing more on the medication. How much they make, right? On average, so this is California as of 2019. So it's a couple of years back. But on average, counseling psychologists make about $95,000 a year. Well, that's an average. If you see a lot more clients, it'll be higher. If you're in a wealthier area, it'd be higher or lower, depending on where you are. Clinical psychologists that make about $109,000 to $110,000 a year. Okay, so a little more education, you would hope they'd make more. And psychiatrists on average, ready to change your career? 242,000 plus a year is the average in California. You're like, I know what I want to be hearing, but a lot of education goes into that, obviously. But these are averages. As I said, some people make way more. I have a friend who is a therapist in Agora Hills, and he makes easily 200,000 a year, and he has a counseling, just a master's degree, right? Because he works with like specific populations. He has a lot of training, and it's a wealthy area, right? So it really depends. Yeah.
I'm finding lately, there's a lot of psychiatrists now that are staying in Squamish and getting their counseling.
So you can do both, right? Yeah, and there are even some clinical psychologists who are getting trained enough to be able to prescribe medication. So it's sometimes it blends, it depends on the state, but yeah, it's interesting. Right? And it's not uncommon, as I said, for someone to see one of these two along with psychiatrists, right? Very, very common. And doctors, medical doctors, like your family doctor, they can prescribe medication too. So you might go to your family doctor struggling with depression, and they could prescribe you an antidepressant. And then you might also be seeing someone to talk about it at the same time. School psychologists are another area where we see people like working in this field. They work in the schools, right? Helping with evaluating students with intelligence and aptitude and dealing with mental illnesses in the classroom. And this typically you have a master's degree as well, right? Typically 2 to 3 years. Social workers work with a little bit more like the intersections of groups. So social workers don't tend to do a lot of therapy, but it's a little bit of their job. But they oftentimes will work with a family and a school and a legal system and support networks, like coordinating services, making sure that somebody has everything that they need. You can be a researcher, right, where you're studying like different things in the field, trying to predict and explain behavior. You could be a forensic psychologist. You could obviously be a professor. There are so many different things you can do with a degree in psychology. It's almost overwhelming how many things you can do. So as I said, I have a master's in counseling psych. On my way to this, I've worked in so many different things. I worked at Starbucks for 2 years as a manager. I loved it. My whole entire graduate degree, I worked at Starbucks and I was caffeinated for free. It was amazing. I managed an REI, right? So, things not related to psychology. And then I got into like behavioral work where I worked with kids who had behavioral issues. I then was an EOPS counselor, an academic advisor and counselor. I was a therapist, and now I'm a professor, all with the degree in counseling. So there's a lot of different things you can do, a lot of different careers. Again, pretty degree dependent though. The master is typically a PhD or even higher. Comments, thoughts, questions, anything here? Again, a lot of you plan on going into this. If you go to like apa.org, it's a wonderful website. They have so many different things about what you need to do each one of these and what are the requirements and so on. Yeah.
Does psychiatry alone, or does that overlap? What the concept?
How do you mean?
Like, would this be like a picture as a staircase, like the 12 years studying all the.
Oh, okay. I mean, typically when you're a psychiatrist, you focus only on that medication, right? Like that's your one focus. But as we were talking about, some people are going a little bit more broad than that. It's just, they make so much money because they have that medical degree. And so the focus is mainly on like the medications and interactions with the medications rather than being trained more in therapy, which we'll talk more about later, which is why we have these two. Typically, these are both called therapists, right? But technically, this is like a marriage and family therapist or a counselor versus this would be more of like a therapist or a clinician, right?
Yeah. See as like the future of psychology. Right now,
Yeah.
there's a big shortage.
There is a big shortage and a lot of like strikes by the different companies providing therapy because there aren't enough of them. There's more and more like virtual. Everything is going like virtual, which is, mixed. Some people love that. Some people hate that. Not my favorite. Like I'd rather be in person, but I think we'll see more and more like online and more like insurance restrictions, which is sad because it gets in the way for people. Let's say somebody has depression and they need, 50 sessions or who knows how many sessions, but their insurance covers 5. That's not going to be enough to help them. So we see more and more like insurance stepping in. We see a lot of internet and online therapy. Those seem to be really common two things right now. We'll see. It's always changing, right? Always dynamic. Anyone else? Other thoughts or questions or comments or anything? No, yeah.
I feel like the big trend that's happening right now is mindfulness, breath work.
Yeah.
yoga,
Yeah.
alternate
Mm-hmm.
forms and like the self-care, all of
Yep.
that.
Yeah. Very much so, right? So mindfulness and self-care stuff has been around forever, but it is so common right now. I'm actually writing a book about self-care. It's a side note, right? Because it just became a joke and then it became something that actually mattered to me at some point. But I mean, like I said, self-cake, I'm good at it. I'm really good at self-caking. But those are things that are huge right now. And we'll talk about both of them actually as we go through. Mindfulness is a massive like field right now. And it's been there for years. But it had a lot of traction right now. There was another hand somewhere in the back. So it's all moving.
For a second, because I was gonna say like they're gonna name itself cake, but then you said it.
Yeah, I thought about it. I thought about naming it self cake, but then no one would know what it was, right? But yeah, I am working on that for sure. Right? I might put a piece of cake on it. The first thing in there will be a piece of cake. Anything else for now? Okay. I forgot one thing when we were talking about stereotypes. I had it written down here. Ever heard therapists or psychiatrists called a shrink before? Right? So shrink, just as a side note, I always like to share these side notes. It comes from the term head shrinker, and it is referencing comparing therapy to the primitive tribal practices of shrinking the heads of your enemies. Right? That's what we tend to think of therapists, right? When we say someone's a shrink, that's the where that comes from. Is shrinking the heads of your enemies, right? So we have a lot of very negative mentalities about therapists and therapy, but most people could benefit from therapy, right? Having somebody neutral to talk to, but not all people are supportive of it. Not all cultures embrace it very much. And again, a lot of stereotypes, like we talked about. Some true and some not. Okay, I'm going to stop here for today so I can take attendance. Next class, we'll start chapter 2. So we talked about how we viewed abnormality in the past and what's normal and abnormal. The next chapter is all about the models of abnormality. How can we view it in a bunch of different ways? So we'll continue to set the stage. I'll give you a minute to pack up and then I'll take attendance and I'll leave this up here in case you want to take a picture or anything of it.
Do we have an assignment?
No, not at all. To enjoy the last of our weather. Like before it gets hot again, that's your assignment. I know, I love this weather.
Are you gonna do your website?
No, abnormality in me. I think that would. Sure. Oh man. Okay.